Today, we will take a look into bias and unbiased sample. Now here is just the academic definition for what a biased sample and an unbiased sample is. This is one of those topics that are better explained by examples, but nonetheless, I do want to expose to you with the definition. We will define a biased sample if individuals or groups from the population are not represented in the sample. And you always create a sample by gathering answers to questions. So pretty much you go somewhere and you start asking questions, and whatever the answers that you get, that's what we're going to call our sample. And a biased sample is if the individuals or the groups from the whole population are not represented in your answers or are not represented in your sample. On the other part, an unbiased sample is if every individual or the element in the population has an equal chance of being selected. A biased sample is something that is biased, which is you're just going to target a certain group. You're not really going to do it randomly. And an unbiased sample is when you actually do the sampling in a random manner. You're not targeting a specific group. You don't want your answers to be leaning into a certain direction. You're just asking questions in a random way. That's what we're going to call unbiased. And if you're questioning a certain amount of groups, you're not really being random, then that's what we're going to call a biased sample. But let's take a look into some examples here. Well, our direction is we need to determine if the following are examples of a biased or unbiased sample, and we need to explain why. Well, let's take a look into here. You're always going to ask a question. That's how you create a sample. And the question is, what is your favorite sport? And say that the sample is chosen from people attending a soccer game. So let's actually think about what kind of questions or what kind of answers are you going to get from this question. You go to a soccer game and you ask the question, what's your favorite sport? Most likely, every single individual that you're going to get an answer from are going to say soccer because you are in a soccer game. You are in a soccer game. The majority of individuals here are going to answer, well, my favorite sport is soccer. So this is an example of a bias sample space, or let's call it bias. This is an example of a bias sample. So it's biased. Oops, sorry about this. I guess I misspelled it here. So this is an example biased. The bias sample. But most importantly, we gotta answer why. Why is it that it's biased? Well, because you're choosing a group in a specific. You're not asking, or how can we phrase this? Yeah, I guess you're not asking a population at random. You are just asking who prefers soccer. So this is an example of a bias sample because you're not really doing randomly. You're going to a soccer game and you're asking them, well, what's your favorite sport? Most likely, every single one is going to tell you soccer because they're there because they actually enjoy soccer in the first place. That's why they went to the game. So now let's look into example B. The question is, you want to ask this question, what is your favorite soft drink? But now let's see. The sample is chosen by picking names out of a telephone book. So now let's think about this. If you're just choosing names randomly from a telephone book, this is an example of an unbiased sample. Why? Because you're just choosing names randomly in a telephone book. So I'm not gonna write that out, but the reason for it is that you're choosing names randomly, and you're choosing from the telephone book. You don't know them. You just want to ask them, and it's such a random process that it will be classified as an unbiased sample. Let's look at example C now. Should more money, well, this is the question that they ask, should more money be put into athletic programs, or should music programs at your school? And now, look at where you're asking the question. It says the sample is chosen from students in the band program. So let's think about this. You ask this question. You ask, well, where do you prefer for us to put the money on? On athletic programs or music programs? And you go ask those students who are in a music program. Most likely, every single one of them is going to tell you, well, I will prefer it to be in a music program, because you're going and asking people who are in the band program. So this is an example of a biased sample. Why? Because you're not doing randomly. You're just choosing a certain amount of, you're just choosing a certain group, which in this case are those in the band program. Let's say you would choose, you would just choose numbers randomly from the attendance roster. Then that way, it has more of a random process. So that will be unbiased. But in this case, this is an example of a biased sample. Here, the last example, in example D, the question is, what is your favorite vacation destination? And look at where you're asking the question. It says the sample is chosen by asking every student in the class. Now, are you doing randomly? Are you targeting a certain amount of, or a certain population? In this case, this will be an example of a unbiased. Every single person that you're going to be asking in the class most likely will have their own unique answer. It's not like you ask a certain group that you already know the answer of. You're just choosing all your students in your class. Most likely you will get random answers. You will get answers. Maybe some people are going to be like, well, I really like the US to visit and vacation. I really like Spain to visit as a vacation. You're going to get answers all over the place. This is pretty much going to be an unbiased sample. So now, here's your entrance ticket.